All right, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting an Auburn professor to speak today. So this is really kind of a full circle moment for me because when I was a graduate student and starting my career, I worked on integrated crop livestock systems, and my research was on the sod-based rotation here at here at Mariana, and also at Headland, Alabama, and Chris Pravat as well. He was working on the economic side and me more on the soil health side. And so it was like saying hello to an old friend to drive past the sod-based rotation today because I spent a lot of time in that field. So my topic was initially supposed to be saving money in integrated crop livestock systems, which is a lot of pressure. And fertilizer costs are high, input costs are high. And I do think that in integrated crop livestock systems, we have opportunity to improve nutrient use efficiency. I also think it's a long-term investment, and we're not going to see a lot of changes right away. And I think I'm going to go through some research that we've done at Auburn University that kind of illustrates that a little bit. But just to kind of set the tone for the presentation, I want to show this quote from George Washington Carver that whenever the soil is rich, the people flourish physically and economically. Whenever the soil is wasted, the people are wasted. A poor soil produces only a poor people. And I think when we're working on these integrated systems, we have an opportunity to really build soil health so that it's productive for future generations. So I'm really kind of framing this in terms of grazed cover crops. I know there's many different types of integrated crop livestock systems. I think that winter annual grazing is the most common integrated crop livestock system that we have here in the tri-state area. And so the opportunities that we have with grazed cover crops allow us to build up the soil and help improve nutrient use efficiency in many ways that I have listed here on the screen. So we know at minimum by having that cover on the soil as opposed to a fallow, we can help protect against erosion and nutrient runoff, which is a great thing. We also, if we manage our grazing well, can get really good root growth to scavenge nutrients deep in the soil profile, bring them back up to the soil surface, and recycle them so that even in our really sandy soils that we have in this region, we're losing less to leaching down into the soil profile. When we're incorporating legumes, this is our best direct benefit in terms of fertilizer savings cost to provide some supplemental nitrogen. The last speaker presented some information on soil compaction, and when we manage correctly, we have opportunities to break up soil compaction with grazed cover crops, even with the trampling of cattle. We also have opportunities if we leave residue on the soil surface to conserve soil moisture in the next crop and increase organic matter storage. So one of the things that I'll touch on is the benefits that we get from cover crops to the cash crop are tied to the amount of residue typically that we leave on the soil surface. So even with small amounts of residue, we expect to get these erosion benefits and nutrient loss benefits, prevention of nutrient loss. But as we increase the amount of residue that we leave behind, that's when we have those opportunities for improving organic matter storage, improving moisture retention in our dryland systems, and even suppressing weed growth. So I want to focus on some research that we had going at the Wiregrass Research and Extension Center, not so far from here, looking at different cover crop grazing systems with the idea of how can we optimize leaving a good amount of residue on the soil that we can use to benefit the subsequent cash crop like cotton or peanut, as well as, still getting some of that economic benefit from the grazing as well. And so we had some research in cotton peanut rotations for 4 years in which we had different grazing treatments, and this was funded by the NRCS. And the reason that it's important that I clarify that is that had a lot of influence on what our treatments and our management consisted of. So at least in Alabama, we have a lot of programs that pay farmers for implementing cover crops, which makes sense because we're getting societal benefits from those cover crops. We're protecting our water from nutrient pollution and so forth. And so we have those opportunities. But in Alabama, we don't have a lot of programs that allow for grazing of those cover crops. And so our NRCS is interested in finding ways that they can get the best of both worlds, pay farmers for implementing cover crops, but still build soil health and prevent erosion. So because of that, the treatments that we included in this study were an ungrazed control where we had a cover crop, where we had a little bit lower management in terms of seeding rate and nitrogen rate. So we had 60 pounds of small grains, which included cereal, rye, and oats, and then 10 pounds of crimson clover and 5 pounds of brassica. And then we had our graze management systems in which we planted those same species, added a little more nitrogen up front to really kickstart that early biomass production so that we could get cattle out quite early. And then we also had 90 pounds of small grains, 15 of crimson clover, and then 5 of the brassica. So our treatments were such that we could remove cattle and then allow for grow back. And the reason that we chose this as opposed to a grazed a height of biomass that we left on the soil surface is that from a practical standpoint, this is something that NRCS can implement. Correct me if I'm saying anything incorrect for Florida, but they're interested in not penalizing farmers if it's droughty conditions and we don't get that amount of grow back. By having these grazing removal dates, then it doesn't penalize farmers if the environmental conditions are not optimal. So we had a mid-February cattle removal date, a mid-March removal date, and a mid-April removal date. And we started grazing after Christmas in these systems, and a lot of that had to do with the university. We closed down for the holidays, the research station staff and everything. But Chris and I have talked about this, that we really probably could have started grazing the third week of December, and that would even further improve the economics of this system if we were in a practical, scenario. So within these different treatments, we were measuring many different factors of soil health, and we consider soil health the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. So basically the benefits that we get from soil. And we attribute those to a variety of different soil properties, including chemical, biological, and physical properties. So chemical, we're measuring things like soil pH, plant available nutrient content. Biological, we're looking at the amount of organisms in the soil, the activity of those organisms, and then physical properties, compaction, and aggregate stability, which is a good indicator of the ability of the soil to resist erosion when we get those heavy periods of rainfall. And then at the center of it all is organic matter, because we know that organic matter is tied to all of these properties. So this is a few images of what these systems look like in Headland, where we have on the left-hand side, this would be our ungrazed cover crop, and this was, again, planted in late October and then terminated in mid-April. And so this would be our mid-February cattle removal date, and this picture was taken in mid-April when we were about to terminate. This would be our mid-March treatment and mid-April treatment. So that mid-April treatment, the cattle were removed essentially right before termination. So this is what that related to in terms of biomass. So we had about 3 tons of biomass in our control cover, and then as we increase that grazing intensity, as we would expect, that amount of biomass tends to decrease. And we'll talk about what influence that had further on. So the way we manage the system is we were terminating 2 to 4 weeks ahead of planting. I know it's been mentioned some waiting in our last presentation. We talked about waiting later, especially in our cotton production systems. We've seen in other research that cotton really doesn't respond well with green planting a lot of times. There's some farmers that can do it successfully, but a lot of times we end up with insects issues or competition issues in cotton production systems. So we always make sure we terminate 2 to 4 weeks ahead of time. This is what that looked like, where we went through and used conservation tillage. So this was a KMC paratill with a subsoiler that's directly perpendicular to the soil surface, so that we're not turning the soil, but rather cutting like a knife through the soil to about 10 to 12 inches, and then terminating chemically at the same time. Then in this right-hand picture, after planting, we can see that residue is nice and dry and not likely to compete with the cash crop that's coming up. So this can be a bit of a bumpy ride after cattle grazing, implementing these conservation tillage systems. but it's a time savings and a cost savings in terms of fuel, going across the field less in terms of tillage operations, which our farmers that we have at the research station were really happy with this system and how we were able to plant into the residue. So these are some pictures of what the system looks like early in the peanut production system. So obviously in our control plots where we had more residue, we've still got a lot of that residue left on the soil surface. And then as we increase grazing lengths, grazing durations, there's less of that residue on the soil surface. Now, we did, of course, return, if I can go back, we did return a lot of those residues through manure deposition, even in those longer grazing periods. So it really just depends. We're still recycling nutrients in these systems, but it depends on the specific producer, right? And what benefits you're trying to achieve. We're in a completely dryland system here. So this residue we know can help us improve our soil moisture retention throughout the growing season. And also we saw after 4 years some increases in organic matter in our less frequently grazed systems as opposed to when we grazed right up to the time of termination. So what this equates to, this is our 4 different cattle removal dates. And at the end of the 4-year study, we had about 1.4% organic matter in the top 6 inches where we had the most intensive grazing system, and then 1.8% organic matter in our control. And then our two kind of medium residues that were left didn't have a negative impact on that soil organic matter, so we feel that this is an indicator that we're going to be building in the long term. But as all of you farmers know that are in these sandy soils, it often will take us 5 to 10 years to see that measurable increase in organic matter in these types of cover crop systems. Our sandy soils, our hot climate, it degrades that organic matter readily. And so it's really a long-term investment where we're adding residues back to the soil in order to get that benefit. So this is results not from our cover crop grazing studies, but really just to illustrate the benefits of organic matter additions to the soil. It's not just about improving our ability to retain or hold on to nutrients and keep them from leaching. Organic matter is also providing a source of nutrients itself. So organic matter is composed of nutrients including nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur. And as it degrades, it is going to release nitrogen back into the soil. So this is from a long-term experiment that we have at Auburn University. And when I say long-term, I mean 128 years of management in winter legume cover crops. And in these systems, you can see that when we've been in continuous cotton with no cover crop, we're at about 1% organic matter in the top 6 inches. And we can actually take soil samples from the rotation and measure potentially available nitrogen during the subsequent year. So we can predict, and of course the actual amount of nitrogen released depends on factors like soil moisture and temperature, but we can predict that in an average year we would get about 6 pounds of nitrogen per acre in this system. But as we start to increase organic matter over time, for example, the second row here is just the addition of a winter legume. No other crop rotation, we're just adding a winter legume into the system. And slowly, over time, we built to 2.5% organic matter. And that's resulting in 70 pounds per acre to the subsequent crop. We have cotton yields to show that this is true. Actually, this was our highest yielding plot, and we made 4 bales of cotton here with no nitrogen added. And that's because of these residues, this organic matter that we've built up in the system. But it does not happen overnight. It takes a long time to get these benefits. And then you can see as we increase organic matter here up to 3%, we're looking at 90 pounds per acre. So you can see what these soils look like. This would be kind of our poorest example with less than 1% organic matter. And this would be a soil with about 2.5% organic matter. They're side by side. They're both in a sandy loam soil type. But the management has changed over time. And so as a general rule of thumb, we expect that for every percent organic matter that we have in a healthy soil, we're going to get a contribution of about 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen to the subsequent crop. So I'm not talking about benefits from, directly from a legume cover crop that precedes, but from the organic matter itself. I hope that makes sense. So the good news is that in these systems, we're starting to see that building of organic matter by incorporating the winter cover crops. Even when we have light grazing, we're not seeing a negative influence on organic matter accumulation. So in the long term, we expect that to have a benefit in terms of nutrient management. Now, I mentioned that we measured a variety of different soil properties. In the short term, in 4 years, we saw no measurable differences in plant available nutrient content. So, for example, malic extractable phosphorus and potassium, soil pH, and no differences in our biological activity in soils. But I do want to kind of go on a little bit of a tangent here with one of the biological measurements that we've done research on. This is a picture under a microscope of a cotton root. And so these little rectangular cells here are cotton plant cells, root cells, and then these little balloon-like structures, it looks like a balloon with a string coming off, those are fungi, and they're a beneficial fungi because what these fungi do, or they act like an extension of the root, so they infect the cotton root, but not in a bad way. They're basically, the strands, the hyphae that they have can explore deeper into the soil, into these small pores that we have, and take up nutrients, and in return, the cotton root gives the fungi a carbon source, so basically food that it needs to live. So in other research, not in this study, but when we've looked at how cover crops influence these beneficial organisms, we've seen that if we plant rye or clover in between our cash crops, we increase the amount of fungi in the next cotton crop, and even in the peanut, we've seen the same thing, compared to leaving it fallow and just having, some weedy growth out in the field. So that's another benefit, that just by having those roots out there, that we can get that benefit out of it. Now, I also want to mention compaction because that's another factor that we saw influenced in this study. So I'm just setting you up with how we measure compaction here. So if you look at this picture, this is 5 different penetrometers. Okay, I'm going to figure this out. Okay, so 5 different penetrometers, which we use to measure soil compaction. And so this would be during cash crop growth. So this is cotton in the row right here. So we have 1 penetrometer measuring soil compaction in the center of the cotton row, and then in between in trafficked and untrafficked rows. And so we're able to make this map of the soil profile. So I want you to imagine that each one of these little squares that I'm showing here is a soil profile. And the top of the square would be our surface. And then the bottom would be about 2 feet deep in the soil. And then we have our trafficked row over here, and then our untrafficked on this side. And so we're able to, it's like we're looking at a slice of the soil profile. And here in this particular map, the blue is indicating less soil strength or less compaction, and the red, more compaction. So even in our, the only treatment that we saw influencing compaction was really this most intensive grazing, in which we had cattle out there for the longest period of time and less residue regrowth at the end of the season. And so even in our mid-February and mid-March cattle removal dates, we didn't really see a negative impact of having those cattle out there. Now, remember that we subsoiled. So, to about 10 inches, we expect to see no effect of grazing. That's why we don't see that surface effect of grazing. And this tends to be pretty important in the soil types that we have here in this region where we can get a compaction layer, about 10 to 12 inches deep in the soil profile. And so the subsoiling allows us to break up some of that surface compaction and allow those cotton roots to grow. So in terms of yield, we never saw any negative impacts of cattle grazing on peanut yield. So we had peanuts every other year this study, cotton every year this study. So this would be our ungrazed treatment. And maybe there's a slight trend downward in peanut yield, but, there was so much variability that we can't say that these are different. Perhaps, that increased compaction in mid-April had a slight negative impact. On cotton growth, we did see some differences. So this is cotton yields across the study for 2019 and 2021. And you can see we're averaging about 1,700 pounds of lint, about 3.5 bales of lint in our ungrazed and mid-February removal dates, and maybe a little bit of a negative impact. And again, we attribute that to that increased residue that we left on the soil surface to help improve moisture retention during the growing season. So I'll get to kind of some concluding points from this study in a moment, but I'd like to, because my topic is nutrient management, I want to go back to these essential nutrients for plant growth. And I think in integrated crop livestock systems, we want to make sure that we're putting out all of our nutrients according to soil test, particularly phosphorus and potassium. Now, what does that mean in terms of a management perspective? I would say if we're sampling prior to the cash crop and we're making sure that our phosphorus and potassium are in that high range, that we should be good for that following forage crop. But if we're more borderline, we may want to add a little bit of extra potassium to make up for the cotton, especially after cotton, the cotton removal of potassium, which is about 20 pounds per bale of lint. But overall, we just want to make sure that they're adequate according to soil test. Now, in terms of nitrogen, depending on whether or not we have that legume in the system, we may be able to save more on nitrogen. So our rule of thumb is that if we've got more than 30% stand of a legume crop, that we don't need to add that additional nitrogen in the springtime to boost growth, that legume cover crop is going to take care of that. One question that I know I frequently get from row crop producers is, what is the nitrogen benefit I'm going to get from a cover crop to my next crop? We're not talking about organic matter, just the fact that this crimson clover is fixing about 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Wouldn't it be great if we got all that to the next crop? But we don't, right? Nitrogen is susceptible to all these different loss pathways. So we should get anywhere between 0 and 50 pounds per acre credit to our next cotton or corn crop, whatever we're looking at. And so the ways that we can increase our chances of getting a credit are making sure it gets to full bloom, making sure we have good biomass production, minimizing the time between cover crop termination and cash crop planting. If we're on a little bit more of a heavy soil or a little bit higher clay content soil, that also increases our chance of getting that legume credit. But people get frustrated when I say it's a coin toss. You might get a nitrogen benefit and you might not. And so I think one tool that we've been working on, the Southern Cover Crop Council and the Northeast Cover Crop Council, especially under the leadership of Chris Reberkorten at North Carolina State University, is a tool that farmers can use to help predict the nitrogen that's going to be available to the next crop. So if this is something that's of interest to you, I encourage you to look this up. Essentially, we're able to take some of our biomass production data, so how much biomass we've actually got out in the field in terms of legume, and then put that into the calculator. We put in the location of our field, and then it pairs with the closest weather station. So based on the moisture and the temperature that you're experiencing, it gives you a better idea of what that nitrogen release is going to be. So the tool cannot predict the future. We don't know what the temperature is going to be. We don't know what the moisture is going to be. But what it can do is help predict that release over time, so that when it comes time to make side dress fertilizer decisions, we can maybe give credit if we feel that it's warranted. This tool becomes more accurate with a forage analysis, because we know that depending on the maturity of a legume cover crop, we may have a higher percentage of protein, which would encourage the decomposition to be quicker, or lignin that would encourage it to be slower. And so by having some information from a forage analysis, that can even then further the accuracy of this tool. So, okay, circling back to my takeaways from some of our research, building soil health with grazed cover crops is a long-term investment. We know that overgrazing can have negative impacts on soil organic matter and soil compaction. The word overgrazing it could mean a lot of different things. So it depends on your individual systems. But if we manage to maximize surface residues, we can hopefully optimize some of those soil health benefits to the following crop, as well as still get some of that economic benefit as well. And so that's my overall takeaways for today, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments?